We just go straight into the next briefing, please.
So our next presentation is from one of our phenomenal ANC historians, Dr. Allison Finkelstein. She's going to talk to us about an action that the cemetery needs to take. That's renaming of Jackson Circle. So I'll ask you to go ahead, and then I'll ask you to give some background on the other three alternatives.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to talk to you about the effort to rename Jackson Circle. As you are all very well aware, Arlington National Cemetery has been tasked with following the directives that have been given to us by the Department of Defense and no longer commemorating the Confederacy or Confederates on Arlington property. So this is something that we have been directed to do, and it's part of a larger effort. So Jackson Circle, if we can go to the next slide, is the circular road that surrounds section 16, which is the section where Confederates, for the most part, are buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The History Office is taking very seriously the request for our support on this road naming effort, and we actually spent a significant amount of time thinking carefully about the names that we think should be suggested for Jackson Circle. And we did this a couple ways. We thought about the interpretive themes that are in our long-range interpretive plan. You'll remember maybe back in 2019, we briefed you about the start of our interpretation program. And as part of that program, we worked together with other stakeholders at the cemetery to determine what are the interpretive themes that should guide the stories we tell at Arlington National Cemetery. So we think about those themes in everything that we do, and we again turn to them for this process. But we're really thinking about the road naming opportunity as a way to broaden the commemorative narrative at the cemetery. Who and what are we commemorating? Why? How can we connect those commemorations to geography at the cemetery, which is really important, especially for section 16. We don't want to be arbitrary. We want to think about the land, the property, and the multi-layered history that it has. And one point that I really want to emphasize to you is that as we look at Southern expansion, the road names we're not talking about for that today, but we know that it's coming up. So we wanted to think holistically about the cemetery and the property. What are the things that we want to commemorate through these road names? And how can we go beyond Arlington's history as just a cemetery? This property, as you all know, has a lot of history and legacy that dates from before 1864 when the property was established. Those dates, those property lines, they don't actually matter when we're talking about the history that happened here. It's all connected. So we wanted to think a little bit bigger than just people who are buried here, people who may have done something here. We want to think about the changes that happened to this land. And that's something that, if given the opportunity, we hope to share with you more for Southern expansion. I also want to make another really important point. We've spent a lot of time thinking about names, but ideally, the process of selecting new road names should be done with community consultation or input, hearing the voices of the American people, of the different stakeholders who are really interested and invested in this site. We have done our best to make suggestions that we think are representing some of the opinions that we hear from us, from descendants of people who were enslaved on this property, from teachers who take their students from across the country on trips here, from veterans and others. So we're trying to listen to that feedback, but we're only 4 people. We can't hear from and meet with everybody. So we would really love to find a way to get some sort of community input, which doesn't mean that we're opening it up to the broader world to throw out the names. We're not going to name Taylor Swift Drive or anything. We'd be thinking about, if we gave people a short list, who would they consider from that short list?
Allison, let me ask you to expand a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Twice you mentioned the word stakeholders.
Yes, yes.
And then you gave us a little bit of a peek there. Talk a little bit more about how you find your stakeholders, how you define them, and who you're working with.
That's a great question. And there's actually a debate going on right now in public history about whether the word stakeholder is even the right term to use, because who has a stake, who deserves a stake, who is guaranteed a stake. So there's been some really interesting articles we've read about that. So I recognize that the term is problematic, and I'd be happy if anybody has a suggestion. For the moment, we're using it. But yes, stakeholder, who is a stakeholder? we in the History Office try to think broadly and inclusively about this. So our visitors, obviously, which could be anybody, but we really like to think who has connections to this property. So descendants of the people who lived, worked, and were enslaved on this site when it was a plantation, including the Lee and Custis family. Yes?
Can I ask a question? Was this section actually part of the original estate, or was this section part of Fort Myers, just as a...
Let me come back to that.
Okay.
Yep, let me come back to that because it's going to take me down a road.
So
Unintended.
descendants of everyone on the property.
Descendants
the
of
owners,
everybody.
the slaves.
Yes.
Okay.
And that is something that we are following the lead of the National Park Service on. So if you'll bear with me for a
Sure,
minute
you're good.
for a tangent, the National Park Service, under the leadership of Mr. Kool-aide, the George Washington Memorial Parkway Superintendent, has created a descendant community group connected to Arlington House, which includes anybody who lived, worked, was enslaved, somehow has a familial connection to that. And our office and the cemetery has been brought into that for the past several years as what's called an institutional partner. So we are an outer circle of institutional partners that's there to support the inner circle of the descendant community, which is truly our descendant community also. And just to get you where we're thinking here, even though the Park Service owns the Arlington House, those property lines don't matter when we think about history because this all was part of that plantation, right? So those property lines mean something for administration, but in terms of the story that we're telling, we can't just not talk about that. So we've really been given a lot of training from Mr. Kool-aide and other specialists that he's brought on about, for lack of a better word, stakeholder and community engagement. So we've been able to really dive into that world. So when we think about our stakeholders, we include those descendants. We include people who have family buried here. We include the surrounding community members, people who live in Arlington County, Fairfax County. Mount Vernon especially is a great example of a stakeholder because many of the enslaved people who worked on this property either first worked at Mount Vernon or their families were enslaved at Mount Vernon. We're thinking about other museum professionals, scholars, professors, students. So we don't want to define it, but we certainly think about descendants, military families, Gold Star families, families of those who are connected here as key stakeholders. I hope that answers the question.
That does answer the question.
So to go back to your question about Section 16, Miss Yates stopped me because she knows I can talk about this history for a long time.
I just
Do you
short
want to answer
answer.
that question?
The answer is it. Remember Fort Myers?
Yes.
The plantation predates
Yes.
the creation of
Perfect.
the military.
Okay. Yep. So it might have.
So-
Yeah.
Oh, it was.
Allison could go
Good,
at
thank you.
length
That's what I
and
was-
give us a history of the land, but the simple answer to your question is it belonged to the plantation before it belonged to Fort Myers.
And then,
But
yeah,
it
perfect.
was-
The plantation was much bigger probably than all of Arlington
Oh,
Cemetery.
really
Yeah.
big.
Perfect. All right. Thank you. That's exactly what I wanted to just.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I
Thank
don't want to
you.
go down the hole there, but how big was the plantation? About how, do you
I
have
don't
an
have
idea?
the exact acreage, but it's
That's
stretched
right.
pretty far,
Okay.
even past Fort Myer today.
Okay, yeah,
Thank you.
okay.
Now, to
Yes.
be direct, the property was part of Fort Myer before
Okay.
it became part of the cemetery when the cemetery assumed that area and grew in that area because some of the graves in section 15
Yes.
were part of the
Yes.
old Fort Myer post cemetery at the time.
And these were reinterred Confederates.
Okay, so
Yeah.
once you revisit how the Confederate graves became section
Okay.
16.
Yeah, she's the historian.
Very quickly.
Yes, very quickly. All right, so,
Take it away, Allison.
all right. After the Spanish-American War, there was an effort by Confederate veterans to advocate for the reburial in one specific set-off section of Arlington National Cemetery. Confederates who had been buried in scattered graves around this cemetery and in Soldiers' Home Cemetery, which we now call Soldiers and Airmen's Home. Legislation was passed by Congress, which allowed this to happen. So it was a decision of Congress. That was passed. These Confederates were reinterred in Section 16.
The year about
1906.
It was just after the turn of the, I was just saying,
Yes.
turn of the century,
1906.
Okay.
Someone check me on that. I think it was 1906.
okay, beginning of the 20th century.
Yes. Yes.
And
So
it
this
was the
designated
idea
by
of
Congress.
Confederate veterans.
Confederates who had been buried in Arlington National Cemetery or soldiers' homes. So at first, they were not veterans. They were service members who died during the course of the Civil War and were buried here. Because if we put ourselves back in the mind of the Civil War, especially in Northern Virginia, the fatality rate was so high. The burials were so large, and this was an issue for sanitation and public health especially. The U.S. Army was burying whoever they could, wherever they could.
And so I believe even some of them came from the Alexandria, what is now Alexandria.
According to the legislation, no. We do
Okay.
not think so, because
Okay.
the legislation only specified Soldiers' Home in Arlington National
Okay.
Cemetery.
All right.
So that is how those Confederates ended up here. And the story,
Soldiers' Home and Arlington.
yes.
They didn't come from all over.
Well, with a
United
few
States.
exceptions, because later on, there were some veterans who were interred here after that legislation. And what I also like to remind people when we give tours is everything that you all are doing today with all of your rules and regulations and carefully thought out decisions, that was not the case for a long time at Arlington National Cemetery. So it's a little bit messy, and it's not the way we would necessarily do things today. We have to put ourselves backwards in time.
And it's important to note that the burials predate the monument.
Yes.
So that's, want to make sure the section 16 predates the idea even of the memorial.
Well, not necessarily.
That would be authorized or replaced. Yeah.
The Confederate veterans who wanted to put the graves here always had in the back of their heads, based on our primary source research, the end goal of placing some sort of memorializing object in the center. And that's why it was created in a circle. They did not know what it would be or what it would look like. It was a planter for a while with some plants in it.
So the Confederate veterans got together, went to Congress, and said, we want to do this.
So they weren't veterans yet, and she's mentioned that.
Well, the
Remember-
Confederate veterans were the ones who
Had the
were
idea.
spearheading the effort.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get into it now, but there was a lot of drama surrounding this whole effort, which got into debates and competitions with women's groups such as the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So my answer is yes, but it was not as simple as that.
Okay.
There was a turf war, you could say.
Were the Daughters of the Confederacy,
Yes.
excuse me, the Daughters of the Confederacy active in this idea for graves?
Yes.
Okay.
And if you want later, if we have time, I can
Okay.
explain
And we-
why that is.
And we can
Yes.
provide you with some
Okay.
reading.
I think the source of
survey-
this is important.
So this is all coming from our survey report that our team and the Cultural Resources team did for the Section 106 process for the removal of the Confederate Memorial. It is over 100 pages or so, fully sourced and footnoted. So I'm giving you just a little bit of a summary of what's in there.
And it is available on our website.
For the public,
That's-
for everyone to
that's- So
read.
I will.
Yes.
Yeah, please do.
I will provide
That'd
you
be
with
great.
that location.
Okay.
So if I may, I want to just take us out of that topic because I don't want to take up too much of your time going through all of the stuff we found in the survey report, and I want to keep us focused on the road names. If we could go to the next slide, please.
Can I ask
Yes,
a question before you get to the road
Yes.
names? I'm an engineer, and so I have a very quantitative mind, and
That is not me.
exactly right. And historians have a much more qualitative mind.
Yes.
So when I think about problem solving, I would like to see a quantitative analysis of how we got here. And I don't know if you've done that. And that was my question. Have you done a more? I'm a dumb Army person. I love the Army. They taught me this thing called MDMP. And when I did MDMP, I had to build a matrix. And so that's where my head goes as this
Okay, share what MDMP is.
the military decision-making process. And there's this very governed, and you build a matrix and you score it. And so that's the other end of the qualitative angle. And I'm wondering, are we also doing that as an Army? That was the question that I was trying to get to.
For
And
what specifically?
for
The names.
the whole thing on how we get to the names and what we recommend. And and I'm not saying we have to. I just trying to understand. We're going to be asked to make a recommendation on a very sensitive topic.
You should not be involved in that whole Army, let's name the bases.
Yeah.
That was nowhere near what you're talking
No,
about. They
but-
were really,
No, but I mean,
that would have.
you have to balance the resources of 4 people, but we're also being asked as a committee to make a recommendation on a very important topic that touches America. And so we have to think about what high bar do we want to see if we're going to put our weight behind a recommendation. So I just want to, before,
That is it.
right? And so when I think about making a recommendation, I want to also understand all of those things that go into the process as an engineer. So that's, and I'm sure my colleagues
So-
would agree. They
So I'd
also
like
want
you to go
to,
back a
if you
slide.
looked at the last
Not
discussion.
jumping ahead.
Okay. As a historian, I will just put out there that we are the exact opposite of engineers, which I learned when I was
Which is
teaching.
why I love your briefing. So thank you.
I learned this when I was teaching at UMD, and I had engineering undergrads in my history of science course, and wow, they taught me a lot about how you all think, and we have a number of engineers here. So you and I, we think completely differently, and that's a good thing because we can bring it all together.
Yes, exactly.
But no, we have not done quantitative analysis because that's not what we think about. We're not thinking about numbers. We're thinking about story. We're thinking about meaning, and we're thinking about legacy. But I think that what you are driving at could be addressed if there was some way to query the public about the names.
Or I was thinking more like, you're thinking about story. How much of the story should contribute to our recommendation? And
You're talking about the weight.
yeah, the weight, like
Yeah.
the weight and the impact. Yeah.
How
So,
much weight do you?
and I'm not
think
saying
about?
we do that here. I just wanted to understand the process. Thank you.
What I would ask
Yes.
to try to get this forward, just can you give us a 30-second snippet of every
Yep.
everybody up there?
I'll
Yes.
move forward. Yep.
Yes, that is the goal.
You brought back a
I'm
lot of
gonna
memories.
start with James Parks. So here's our short list, but we're gonna start with James Parks, which is our top recommendation. So I want to do the snippet of him first. How many people here are familiar with James Parks? Okay, so this actually supports our point with this recommendation. James Parks was enslaved at the Arlington estate. After he received his freedom, he started working for the U.S. Army as a civilian employee for the Army Quartermaster Corps. Here at the cemetery, he was a counterpart to many of us civilians today. He worked here helping to build and create the cemetery, digging the graves. Many of these graves throughout the early section of the cemetery were dug most likely by Mr. Parks and his other counterparts. He worked here until fairly late in his life in the 1980s, and the Secretary of the War actually provided
1880s.
in his 80s,
Oh, in his-
his 80th year, decade of life. So he did not work here until the end of his life, but until he was quite elderly. The Secretary of War actually approved for him to be buried here at Arlington National Cemetery with military honors. He is, as far as we know, the only person born on this property who is also buried at this property.
He's the only one.
As far as we know. As far as we know, yes. So he lived his entire life here. He dedicated his life to creating Arlington National Cemetery as we know it today. Enslaved at the Arlington Plantation, witnessed the onset and the destruction of the Civil War, saw all of that here, the creation of the forts that became Fort Myer. He was an eyewitness to all of this. He saw the development of the cemetery from its absolute creation, and he spent his life supporting that effort as a civilian employee, not unlike many of us.
How did you find out about Mr. Parks?
So Mr. Parks' story is quite widely known among some circles of people, scholars and communities of African Americans and other people interested in Arlington County history. So he's somebody that I can't even tell you how I found out about him because I've read about him and studied about him. We did not discover him. He is fairly well known among some people who are interested in cemetery history. Yes,
I
sir.
suspect you have the source Secretary of War approval. I suspect it's written somewhere, right? Or is that?
It's on his headstone.
Okay,
actually.
yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
it is on his headstone.
Yeah.
So one of the things I also want to say is that we are actually in touch and working with his descendants, his two great-granddaughters, who actually worked with us on a program for Juneteenth that I'm going to talk about this afternoon at the education update, so I'm not going to go into that now. You will hear about it, but we have been working with them, and I also just want to pause for a moment. They are his great-great-granddaughters. That's actually not that far of separation from Mr. Parks. And every time I think about that, it kind of gives me a little bit of a spine chill. This really is not history that is that long ago. It's over our 25-year mark from the last discussion. It's from the Civil War, but his great-great-granddaughters are working with us today. One of them was actually a 30-year Army civilian at the Pentagon.
Well, Allison, may I
Yes.
ask, forgive the interruption, is there any record of military service with Mr. Parks?
Not for Mr. Parks, but several of his children and grandchildren served in the military and are buried at Arlington National Cemetery.
Did you weight that in your recommendation, knowing he wasn't a veteran, despite a remarkable story, of course?
So one of the things that we're really thinking about in terms of whether a name of a road should be a veteran is why we think that has to be the only course of action. First of all, it's not the case for every road here at Arlington National Cemetery. For example, Ida Lewis Drive, she was not a recognized veteran, the female lighthouse operator who has an incredible story. But again, we're looking at this property as more than just a military cemetery. We are looking at the people and places that are all part of this story. And when we think about the United States and our history holistically, we can't just divide it between the military and the non-military. And this is something that I think about a lot in other research we do. Should we not honor Gold Star mothers and widows because they're not veterans? So,
Where is it?
yeah, yes, ma'am, yes,
In your process?
yes.
I see you have the 4 names. Were you limiting yourself strictly to just people names, or did you think outside of names such as concept series? Like, I know the discussion at Fort Bragg was to get away from names after
Yep,
everybody's
Yes.
presentation and go with, what's it?
Liberty.
Liberty.
yes,
Liberty.
yes.
Did you look at that as opposed to?
Yes, we did. And in the initial version of the presentation that we had wanted to present, we were going to talk about this road name in conjunction with potential road name shortlists for roads that will be created with southern expansion. So with those road names, which we're not talking about today, we thought about many that are not actually a person. And we were going to talk about that in more depth. But the reason we are thinking about James Parks as really the top person on the short list here is because of geography, which we think is really important. This is section 16, and this is the grave of Mr. Parks. The fact that they're so close together in this section of the cemetery that is really representative of the Civil War here at Arlington, we think gives a lot of strength to this. His story is so central, and yet it's so overlooked. I think when I asked for the show of hands, not to judge, but not a single member of the committee had heard of him. And for many years, his story, like the story of many other enslaved people, has been an afterthought, not just here at Arlington, but throughout American history. And we see this as an opportunity to shine a light on his story. As institutional historians, he was a key player in the creation of this institution. We would think about this as functioning like a living memorial to Mr. Parks, who is memorialized on his headstone, but that's another topic that would take us down another road. There's a lot to discuss about his headstone. This would go very far to help the process of healing historic relationships connected to this property. Mr. Parks' descendants, many of them still live in this area. Many of the African American people who were either enslaved at Arlington or lived at the Freedmen's Village on this property were essentially booted out of their homes multiple times due to the expansion of the cemetery, the creation of Joint Base Meyer-Henderson Hall, the creation of the Pentagon. There is still a feeling of much sorrow among people in this area. This would go a very long way towards helping that. And when we talked about it with his descendants, they were taken aback, extremely honored, said they would support this and want to share it with the rest of the family. Unfortunately, they had a recent death of a very elderly, important family member this past week, so we couldn't go any further. We need to respect them. But we feel, and they feel, that this is something that needs to be very seriously considered.
Are you going to talk about your other names?
Yes,
Can I ask
definitely.
one question? Sorry, and walk me through the approval process. It maybe if that part, like you come up with names as the cemetery, you recommend them. Or how does that you recommend them to the Department of Defense. Department of Defense kind of signs off. How does that flow work? And
Secretary of the Army is the decision maker.
Okay.
All right. So as with anything that's being memorialized at Arlington National Cemetery, it's within the advisory committee's charter. And so there'll be some recommendations made. The recommendations will flow and the committee can render a recommendation. We would like the committee to render a recommendation. And then the secretary will, this KDA, the organization, will render a recommendation. It'll go to the secretary for decision.
But in making your recommendation to the Secretary of the Army, I know you have to give us advice. Do you also have to go through some of those other processes, like and will this decision go through some of those other external processes as well that will eventually play out?
No.
Okay, so only the removal of the memorial, which is
Can you please talk to the Army memorialization policy at all?
The Army Memorial.
The process?
So for everything dictated by legislation, though, for ANC specific, that program doesn't apply. But for the things that are, of course, Arlington's a special place. We have a lot of, laws that we have to follow that the rest of the Army doesn't have to for their Army memorialization program. But we do use that Army memorialization program criteria when there isn't a law that's just special to ANC.
maybe more specific. I was like, does section 106 apply to this naming process or not?
No.
Okay.
Because it's a road name, so
Yeah,
it's not a piece of cultural. It's not a material resource. It's a name.
All right, thank you.
And one thing I wanted to point out from the Army memorialization program is that you are allowed to memorialize civilians, of course.
It doesn't have to be someone who served in the military.
And at Arlington, we have people who are civilians that have roads named for them. We also have a lot of roads named for people who are not buried here,
That's correct.
which is something that we could think about as well. But Mr. Parks is buried here. So if we could go back to the other slide, please. Thank you. I'll go over quickly, if I can, the other ideas that we thought about. But I want to remind you, we're thinking about geography, and as historians, we both look to the past, but we look to the future, and we're thinking about southern expansion coming up, and some of these we think might be more appropriate there. One of the names that we have is Syphax Circle, which we think would be a much more appropriate name for southern expansion roads. The Syphax family has a really complex and fascinating history, which I'm only going to give you a snippet of today. But members of the Syphax family were enslaved at Arlington Plantation. One of them, Maria Syphax, was actually the daughter of George Washington Parke Custis and an enslaved woman named Ariana Carter. So Maria Syphax was in many ways the matriarch of this family. She married Charles Syphax, who was enslaved at the plantation. They actually married inside the house in the same room where Robert E. Lee and his wife were married. They have a long history here at the property. Maria Syphax was actually given her, eventually, through a long story, she received her freedom and she was given her own property in a corner of what is now Joint Base Meyer Henderson Hall. The family established a home there for decades, which was not too far from Freedman's Village. They were booted from their land with the construction of parts of what's now Joint Base Meyer Henderson Hall. They lost the property. They also had a family cemetery there. All of those graves were removed and taken to a cemetery in Maryland. This is another part of the story of this property, which is still very actively being talked about among community members who are dispersed across the country, but many still living here at Arlington National Cemetery. Some Syphax descendants served in the military and are buried here at the cemetery. We want to find a way to honor them. We're actually going to be talking about their story as part of our Southern expansion interpretation efforts. Again, thinking about geography in the future, if we have an opportunity to name roads in Southern expansion, a road that's actually closer to their former property would be better. Another two options that we have, Sergeant Major Milton Holland, who was born into enslavement and joined the 5th U.S. Colored Troops in 1863. He was a Medal of Honor recipient during the Battle of New Market Heights and Chafin Farm, and he is buried here at Arlington National Cemetery. And then lastly, we have Selena Gray, who was enslaved at Arlington House. We actually have a very rare photograph of her that was discovered by Park Service researchers some years ago. She, during the war, worked to protect the George Washington heirlooms that were in Arlington House. And she's also another important part of the story of enslavement on the Arlington Plantation. So because this is a little bit closer to Arlington House, we wanted to consider her as well. But we do feel very strongly that due to the location of James Parks' grave and his important legacy here, that is our number one choice. Although we do not have the choice, that's the name that we're strongly recommending, especially due to the connections that we have with that community and hopefully the opportunity to be able to name some other roads and have that holistic thinking in the future with southern expansion.
Let me ask you a question, and this is a can of worms, so this is maybe a topic that we don't want to talk about, but I have to go back to what you taught us and what I have been told was the origin of this section of these circular graves of Confederates.
Yes.
That it was in the early part of the 20th century, late part of the 19th century, where we were trying to bring people together. That's the story. So we have these Confederate graves that are in a Union cemetery. We're not allowed to name anything about Confederate generals or military people or people who held slaves. But I'm wondering, everyone you've listed up here is an enslaved person born or having something to do with Arlington House.
Yes.
And I think that's obviously commendable. Jerry and I were talking before we got started about the discussion on the memorial and how it's such an emotional topic for people. And everyone has an opinion on how much revision do you want to put into history. Did you all think anything about trying to find someone who was tied to the Confederacy? Maybe a woman who was working to try and get back to rapprochement or coming together, so you continue the theme without stepping over the line of you're not going to name it after a Confederate.
There's the line. The line is a line, and you can't toe that line or have 1 foot over it. But I want to say
I might offer it though.
Well, actually,
you
let me finish.
could ask them, right?
Let her finish.
I'll let you finish. Yeah,
Because I'm gonna.
You get the gist of my
I
question.
do. I'm gonna answer your question. So
I'll let her go.
the story that this Confederate memorial is about reconciliation is a story that was created to further racial injustice and create a mythological narrative about what the Confederacy was about. That is what the Confederate veterans and their supporters wanted to do with that memorial. And when you look at the primary source documents, the speeches...
That is completely false. That is Ed Ayers.
I need to ask the public, if you would like to speak, you must raise your hand and be recognized by the chairperson.
If we want to continue there's a lot of scholarship and primary source documentation that demonstrates, without a doubt, the real intentions of Confederate memorials, not just at Arlington National Cemetery, but throughout the country, north, south, east, and west, because they were not contained just to the south. The goal was to use the guise of reconciliation to put forward a new version of American society that in many ways
President McKinley,
replicates what was
that is
the
wrong.
status quo during the American Civil War. So if we want to think about
Allison,
continuing,
stop.
okay.
I need to ask the public not to speak, or we're going to have to
It's
ask
about
you to
forgiveness.
depart.
So Allison, you're doing a remarkable job.
That's okay.
And you're as a historian, you're innately neutral.
Yes.
And so you rely on research, you rely on data,
Yes.
and you're to be commended because this is a hot topic,
Yes.
as we know. As a long recovering communicator, I wanted to ask,
Yes.
to pull the thread on what we're talking about here, had you thought about choosing instead a word like freedom or liberty or truth for it, and then there is a story, Mr. help me out here, sorry. Mr. Park's story is the illustration at the memorial, because what happens is when we name streets, parks, cemeteries, monuments over a person, the story is lost,
Yes.
right? The story is lost. If we know it's Mr. Parks, we say, how interesting, but we don't really dive into that. But far more, there's science behind, if you want to, just like radio is the most visual medium, a word is far more descriptive of a feeling, an emotion, a concept than a name. So had you thought it all the way, and oh, by the way, it would draw less heat, and it would be less controversial, and there would be fewer discussions about why not.
Less explanation as to why.
And why, and then why not a veteran, and why not this person, and why not that?
Let me go back to my original question and let
I do want to
Allison
address
finish
that.
it. My question was, and I was under the impression that it was for, and help me with
Reconciliation.
Reconciliation, thank you. I want to say rapprochement, but the same thing. So even the idea of finding someone who we would think was active in trying to bring people together, that would be pretty hard to do because you're finding source material that said it wasn't really about reconciliation.
Correct, and
Okay,
that is
that
outlined
answers my
in
question.
great detail in
And
the
that would-
survey report. But
Okay.
if we could just kind of go with what you're saying for a moment.
Then we get back to Rosemary's
Yes,
idea.
ma'am. I really appreciate all these questions and I'm very excited. But I want to go back to something that you said. Could we try to find something that is about reconciliation? Putting aside the long-held historical arguments about what Civil War reconciliation was about. By choosing a name or a concept, which I will come back to, that talks about people or communities that were at the receiving end of the problems created by so-called reconciliation. That is a way of actually enacting reconciliation.
Okay, I see
So
what you mean.
if we're going to go with that, right, and let's say that you tell us it needs to be about reconciliation, using a name here that is an enslaved person, or someone, let's say, who fought for civil rights, or someone who was involved in another struggle related to emancipation, that in itself is an effort at reconciliation in the modern
I see
day.
what you mean.
It helps continue that. But I do, ma'am, I think, Rosemary, your idea is fantastic. I absolutely love that. And that is why I started this briefing by saying that this is what we came up with, but we want to hear other voices.
How about reconciliation circle?
These are fantastic ideas, and one of the things that I've learned in the past couple years is that a couple historians in a room, we do great work, but we think a certain way. When you bring other people in to the conversation, whether that is stakeholders or you all, or name somebody, you get creative ideas that we would never think of. And that's why I said that, because I love those ideas. Those
It
are
would be
fantastic.
it would be heartbreaking for the U.S. Army to put themselves in the soup of a national
Debate.
Yes.
debate that did not stand on reason, fact, research, or anything, but just because this is where the country is right now. Instead,
Yes.
you're opening the doors by giving them a concept, and they're sucked into
All right,
this.
But it also
let's hold
begs-
on for a minute. I'm gonna suspend this right here, okay? Because we have to move on, and we're not gonna come to a conclusion today. We've had to silence people out there. So you only know, even the naming convention could not restrain themselves from using names.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, all they did was change the name from Hood to another general. They did it at Benning, right? They could not refrain from that themselves. So let's suspend this. We'll have this on the agenda the next time. We've already reached our limit.
Yes, thank you.
Great short list.
It was
And
Wonderful.
just keep this in the back of your mind, and we will ask Renee that this is the number one topic when we reconvene. Or
Do we have a
it'll
date?
be maybe 1 and 2 again, because we probably are not gonna,
Do we have a date by which we have to have the name?
or do you have a suspense?
We have a suspense, but we will work with the committee to coordinate and collaborate on that.
We can do it We can do it via
Great work.
email if we
Great
have
work.
to.
Thank you. Thank you
Well,
all
thank
for
you very
your
much.
feedback. I really
And
appreciate
so
it.
what I would like to say to the subcommittee, let's stop it here. We'll not have a subcommittee discussion
On this.
on this or the other topic because we're supposed to move into honor subcommittee. And I will
We have-
work,
we have
we'll
some
work
time.
with the
We have 30
committee.
minutes.
Yeah, we'll work with the committee.
You have another
Oh, I still
20
have 30
minutes.
minutes.
Not by the agenda, but you can take that time. We only need a few minutes to reset for the next.
Mark, if I could ask
Go
something,
ahead.
just in shaping future meeting agendas, these are supremely complex topics in the middle of a very polarizing nation. And so I worry, we have to figure out how to balance giving the issue due diligence so we feel comfortable making a recommendation to the full committee that's going to go to the Secretary of the Army versus kind of, shortchanging all of the substantive matters here that don't allow us to do that. So I don't know
No
how you
expectations.
balance that, but yeah.
This was a briefing to provide you information on
Perfect.
what, and I believe what I think that our historians received
Yep.
the message, and what I took down was the qualitative, quantitative discussion. How do we go about what method? I think we owe that back to the subcommittee, if that is something you want to hear. We are, as a cemetery, we are in the public process for the Section 106 and the environmental compliance for the memorial. The public will have an opportunity to speak to us on all these topics on the 23rd of August in our public meeting. So what's important today was that the information be conveyed and then to give it to you, and then what do you as committee members want back so that you can continue to consider this.
Where I was going is it almost feels like the framing and the timing, if we could get a little crisper on what you need from us on the front end so that the future ones, I think it'll make it productive. The other one was just thank you. This is great.
Let's formalize this so we can get it in a minute. So I would like to make a motion and see a show of hands who are in favor of tabling this and this being a topic the next time we meet. All in favor?
All right.
Okay, we have a consensus on that.
So this was an informational
Yeah,
presentation.
and so we've been enlightened a little bit. We see the emotion that came out in this public forum. So we'll table this one. Since we have a few minutes, I want to open it up to